Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for another webinar in our Market Access and International Approval webinar series. My name is Kevin and I'm part of the Testing and Certifications technical staff here at Vista Compliance Laboratories. Today we'll be presenting to you the certification and approval regulations as well as the technical requirements for electrical equipment, electronics, and wireless, and along with device approval in the European Union. As an EMC RF compliance test lab and certification body, we focus on wireless and RF device approvals. So today we will be primarily going over the requirements of the European Union. This includes some of the most populous countries of the European Union, such as Spain, France, Germany, and Italy. So if you aren't aware of what we do at Vista Laboratories, we are an EMC RF compliance test lab and product certification body, and we are experts in global regulatory approvals for radio frequency devices. So today we'll be going over the requirements of radio frequency and telecommunications approval in the European Union. In this webinar, we will provide an opportunity of the major topics necessary to get your radio devices on the right track for authorization and distribution in the European Union. If you have any more questions on the topics presented today, or any other immediate questions regarding compliance testing and product certifications, you can reach us at info@vista-compliance.com. So let's begin the presentation. So what is CE? The Conformité Européenne, or CE mark, is a declaration by the responsible party that the product labeled meets the requirements of the applicable EU directives. The CE marking is an indication, but not proof, of a product's compliance with European Union health, safety, and environmental protection directives and regulations. CE marking on a product indicates to government officials that the product may be legally placed on the market in their country. CE marking on a product ensures the free movement of the product within the EFTA and European Union single market, which is a total of 30 countries. The EC Declaration of Conformity is the written statement and the single declaration drawn up by the manufacturer to demonstrate the fulfillment of the EU requirements relating to a product bearing the CE marking they have manufactured. The CE marking on a product permits the withdrawal of the non-conforming products by customs and enforcement/vigilance authorities. So moving on to the EU new legislative framework. To improve the internal market for goods and strengthen the conditions for placing a wide range of products on the EU market, the new legislative framework was adopted in 2008. It is a package of measures that aim to improve market surveillance and boost the quality of conformity assessments. It also clarifies the use of CE marking and creates a toolbox of measures for use in product legislation. There are over 20 CE directives, but when we talk about EU market access for electrical products, we're talking about compliance with the essential requirements of these directives. So we have the electrical and electronic engineering industries, or EEI, and the EU policies affecting the EEI covers 3 major areas. So we have EMCD, which covers all equipment that can generate or be affected by electromagnetic disturbance. RED, which applies to all products using the radio frequency spectrum, or LVD, which is covering health and safety risks caused by electrical equipment of specific voltage ranges. As a manufacturer, there are other directives you or your suppliers will need to be aware of, such as RoHS directives, WEEE directives, and battery directives as well. But today we're going to cover these 3 directives in the electrical and electronic engineering industries, which includes electrical devices, radio equipment, and telecommunication industries. Some examples include mobile phones, the mobile network infrastructure, TV sets, power supply units, wireless routers, maritime radars, sensors, and much more. And so moving on, we're going to give an overview of EMCD. So this includes the mandatory products and excluded products, a conformity assessment, the required technical documentation, the CE mark itself, and post-market surveillance as well. So background on EMCD. So all electrical devices influence each other, whether interconnected or close to each other, such as interference between TV sets, GSM handsets, radios, and nearby washing machines, or electrical power lines. The purpose of electromagnetic compatibility is to keep all of those side effects under reasonable control. EMC designates all of the existing and future techniques and technologies for reducing disturbance and enhancing immunity. The Electromagnetic Compatibility EMC Directive 2014-30 EU ensures that electrical and electronic equipment does not generate or is not affected by electromagnetic disturbance. EMCD entered into the force on the 18th of April 2014 and will be applicable as of April 20th, 2016. The new EMCD will replace the existing EMCD Directive 2004-108 EC as of the 20th April 2016. The Directive 2004-108 EC is the current old directive. So EMCD applies to products that were covered by the RNTTE directive, but not covered now by the RAD, telecommunication terminal equipment, and EMCD no longer applies to products covered by the RED. And let's look at a list of regulated products under EMCD. So under EMCD, equipment is categorized as apparatus or fixed installation. An apparatus is any fixed appliance made available on the market as a single functional unit intended for the end user and liable to generate electromagnetic disturbance, or the performance of which is liable to be affected by such a disturbance. This would include things such as computer disk drives, USB memory sticks, and household appliances. And then we have fixed installation, which is a particular combination of several types of apparatuses where applicable, other devices which are assembled, installed, and intended to be used permanently at a predefined location. This includes things such as air conditioning, lighting, and power supply networks. And here we have a list of exempted products under EMCD. The following categories of products are exempt or not regulated by the EMCD. This includes things such as equipment without electrical and/or electronic parts. And explicitly excluded equipment includes radio products, aeronautical products, and radio equipment intended for use by radio amateurs. Equipment covered by other specific union legislation includes things such as motor vehicle equipment, medical devices, marine equipment, agricultural equipment, and then also inherently benign equipment. So it is capable of generating or contributing to electromagnetic emissions which exceed a level allowing radio and telecommunication equipment and other equipment to operate as intended. And it will operate without unacceptable degradation in the presence of the electromagnetic disturbance normally present in its intended environment. The last main exempted product includes custom-built evaluation kits. So these are used by professionals for the purpose of research and development, such as cables, batteries, and corded headphones. So moving on to EMCD conformity assessment. So the general idea is the manufacturer shall perform an EMC assessment of the apparatus based on the relevant phenomena in order to ensure that they meet the essential requirements. As noted above, the EMCD does not require the mandatory intervention from a third party, such as a notified body or laboratory, when carrying out the assessment. The EMCD sets out mandatory essential requirements formulated in a general manner for all equipment, such as an apparatus and fixed installations, within its scope. The essential requirements define the results to be attained, but do not specify the detailed technical requirements. It also allows adapting the equipment and product design as a result of the technological progress. The appropriate technical solution to meet the 26 requirements are not imposed as long as the equipment complies with the essential requirements. Compliance with the applicable harmonized standards gives presumption of conformity to the essential requirements of the EMCD, meaning complying with the applicable harmonized standard means conformity with the essential requirements. Applying several standards may be necessary to address all relevant phenomena in all relevant frequency ranges. For multifunction apparatuses, it may be also necessary to select standards relevant to the primary functions. When the manufacturer chooses to apply harmonized standards, he shall select them in the following precedence order: product-specific standards, if available, product family standards, if available, and then generic standards. An EMC assessment where no harmonized standards have been applied are usually done when no harmonized standards, or where they do not cover all the essential requirements applicable to the apparatus. Technical documentation shall be prepared by the manufacturer to demonstrate evidence of compliance with the essential requirements. The compliance of apparatus with all relevant essential requirements is declared by an EU Declaration of Conformity issued by the manufacturer based inside or outside the EU or his authorized representative in the EU. As the DOC is an official declaration of compliance with the legislation, it must be signed by the manufacturer or his or her authorized representative. So continuing on with EMCD conformity assessment. So for EMC assessment, the product specification is required. The harmonized standard applied is EN 55032. 2012, and it's the electromagnetic compatibility of multimedia equipment and emission requirements. So this is radiated and conducted emissions. Then we have EN 55024 2010, the information technology equipment, which is an immunity characteristic and limits and methods of a measurement, which is radiated and conducted immunity and burst, surge, EFT, ESD. For testing, the lead time is 1 to 2 weeks, and one testing sample is required, and the test reports is part of the technical documentation. So moving on with the EMCD conformity assessment. So for the technical documentation, this must include the product identification and specification, the general description of the apparatus, schematics, block diagram and designs, the description and explanation as necessary for the understanding of these documents, and the operation of the apparatus. Evidence of compliance with the harmonized standards, if they have been applied, EU type examination certificate issued by the notified body, and an EU declaration of conformity. For the EU type examination and certificate, modifications to the approved type that may affect the conformity of the apparatus with the essential requirements of this directive should be communicated to the notified body. The notified body must review the technical design as it pertains to the relevant essential requirements of the EMC directive and issue an EU type examination certificate to the applicant indicating the aspects of the essential requirements that have been assessed. And for the compliance of apparatus with all relevant essential requirements is declared by an EU Declaration of Conformity issued by the manufacturer based inside or outside of the EU or his authorized representative in the EU. As the Declaration of Conformity is an official declaration of compliance with the legislation, it must be signed by the manufacturer or his or her authorized representative. By drawing up the EU Declaration of Conformity, the manufacturer shall assume responsibility for the compliance of the apparatus with the requirements laid down in this directive. For the contents of the Declaration of Conformity, the object of declaration, the identification of the apparatus allowing traceability, it may include a color image of sufficient clarity where necessary for the identification of the apparatus. The CE marking is a key indicator but not proof of a product's compliance with European Union health, safety, and environmental protection directives and regulations. There are no specific color requirements for the letters and background of the CE mark. In other words, it is not required to print the letter CE in black against a white background. However, the color scheme for the foreground and background should be sufficiently complementary so that the CE logo is clearly visible. The vertical dimension cannot be less than 5 millimeters, and for the product, it must also be accompanied by additional information such as contact info and use and installation disclaimers, and etc. And so, moving on to EMCD surveillance, member states are required to take all appropriate measures to ensure that equipment is placed on the market only if it complies with the requirements of the EMCD, and they must maintain the technical documentation for 10 years. The penalties are determined by the member states. Penalties for non-compliance are proportionate to the infringement and may be increased if the relevant economic operator has previously committed similar infringements. Sanctions are imposed by means of fines whose sum vary from one member state to the other. They may include criminal sanctions for serious infringements. Non-compliant products are subject to corrective measures, bans, withdrawals, or recalls. And so we have completed the Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive, or EMCD, and now we're going to move on to the Radio Equipment Directive, or RED. And so an overview of RED, so we're going to go over a general overview of it. We're going to talk about the mandatory products and excluded products, the conformity assessment, the technical documentation, the CE mark, and the surveillance. So background on RED. So RED development started in 2007. So the Radio Equipment Directive 2014-53 EU, RED, establishes a regulatory framework for placing radio equipment on the market. It ensures a single market for radio equipment by setting essential requirements for safety and health, electromagnetic compatibility, and the efficient use of the radio spectrum. It also provides the basis for further regulation governing some additional aspects. These include technical features for the protection of privacy, personal data, and against fraud. Furthermore, additional aspects covering interoperability, access to emergency services, and compliance regarding the combination of radio equipment and software. The RED was published in the OJEU on the 22nd of May 2014 and entered into force on the 11th of June 2014 and is applicable as of the 13th of June 2016. It included a one-year transitional period, which ended on the 12th of June 2017. During the transitional phase, manufacturers were allowed to place on the market radio equipment compliant with either the RED or the EU legislation applicable before the 13th of June 2016. Pure radio sound and radio TV receive-only equipment, which has been excluded from the R&TTE directive, falls within the scope of the RED. Equipment operating below 9 kHz falls within the scope of the RED. Radio determination equipment is now clearly included within the scope of the RED. Pure wired telecom terminal equipment now falls outside of the scope of the RED. And so moving on to the regulated products under RED, this includes radio equipment that is an electrical or electronic product which intentionally emits radio waves for the purpose of radio communication and receives radio waves for the purpose of radio communication. An electrical or electronic product which must be completed with an accessory such as an antenna so as to intentionally emit radio waves for the purpose of radio communication and receive radio waves for the purpose of radio communication. So RF modules, as well as components that have an embedded RF module, also fit this definition. And so here we have a list of exempted products under RED. So the following categories of products are exempted and or not regulated by the RED. This includes radio equipment exclusively used for activities concerning public security, defense, and state security. radio equipment used by amateurs and not placed on the market, marine equipment, airborne equipment, custom-built evaluation kits for the purpose of evaluation, research, or development, and specific and explicitly stated cases such as antennas, infrared devices, and cablings and wiring. Alright, so moving on to the RED conformity assessment. So for the essential requirements, they are applicable to all radio equipment, and the protections of health and safety of persons and of domestic animals, and the protection of property, including the objectives with respect to safety requirements set out in Directive 2014-35 EU, and then the adequate level of electromagnetic compatibility as set out in Directive 2014-30 EU, that it both effectively uses and supports the efficient use of radio spectrum in order to avoid harmful interference. The essential requirements applicable only to certain type of radio equipment pursuant to specific legal acts adopted by the Commission. These are currently only applicable to radio equipment supporting access to emergency services. A manufacturer which has the intention to apply a harmonized standard for the conformity assessment of its products has to apply in priority the product-specific harmonized standard, and only if this one is not available, the generic one, in order to benefit of presumption of conformity with the essential requirements of the RED. And for Annex 2, a manufacturer is required to issue a DOC when the compliance of radio equipment with the applicable requirements of the RED has been demonstrated, and declares it is their sole responsibility through internal production control that the radio equipment concerned satisfies the essential requirements. For Annex 3, conformity to type described in the EU Type Examination Certificate from NB review, and declares responsibility through internal production control. And for Annex 4, the notified body must perform assessments to verify compliance of the quality management system with the requirements. And so moving on, we're going to talk about health and safety. So the harmonized standards applied is EN 62479-2010. This is the low power electronic and electrical equipment with the basic restrictions related to human exposure to electromagnetic fields between 10 megahertz and 300 gigahertz. And then we have EN 62368-1-2014. This is the audio, video, information, and communication technology equipment and its safety requirements. For testing, lead time is 1 to 2 weeks, but this varies, and then one test sample is required as well. And so moving on to conformity assessment for electromagnetic compatibility. So the harmonized standards applied is ETSI EN 301-489-1 version 2.1.1 and ETSI EN 301-489-17 version 3.1.1. For testing, the lead time is 1 week, but this can vary, and one test sample is required. And now keep in mind, these are different than the EMC standards. EMCD standards, these are radio EMC standards. And so for the RED conformity assessment for radio, the harmonized standards applied is ETSI EN 300-328 version 2.1.1. This is the wideband transmission systems, data transmission equipment operating in the 2.4 gigahertz ISM band and using the wideband modulation techniques. Harmonized standards covering the essential requirements of Article 3.2 of Directive 2014-53 EU. For testing, the lead time is 1 to 2 weeks, but this can vary, and one test sample is required. And for items such as 4G cellular devices and base stations, this can take up to 4 to 6 weeks. Moving on to the required technical documentation and labeling. So for technical documentation, the product general description is required along with the internal and external photos, the software and firmware affecting compliance, the user information, and installation instructions. Along with the EU Type Examination Certificate issued by the notified body, the EU Declaration of Conformity, the declaration that radio equipment has been constructed so that it can operate in at least one member state, And for the labeling, the CE marking must be on the product or packaging if not feasible to be on the product. The identification number by type, by batch, by serial number corresponding to the DOC. And for the label, a minimum height of 5 millimeters is required. So moving on to surveillance under RED, member states are required to take all appropriate measures to ensure that equipment is placed on the market only if it complies with the requirements of the RED, and it must maintain the technical documentation for 10 years. For penalties, this is determined by member states. Penalties for non-compliance are proportionate to the infringement and may be increased if the relevant economic operator has previously committed similar infringements. Sanctions are imposed by means of fines, whose sum vary from one member state to another. This may also include criminal sanctions for serious infringements. Non-compliant products are subject to corrective measures, bans, withdrawals, or recalls. And so that covers the Radio Equipment Directive, or RED. And we're going to move on and talk about the Low Voltage Directive. So the Low Voltage Directive 2014-35 EU ensures that electrical equipment within a certain voltage limits provides a high level of protection for European citizens and benefits fully from the single market. It has been applicable since the 20th of April 2016. The LVD covers health and safety risk on electrical equipment operating with an input or output voltage of between 50 and 1,000 volts for alternating current, and then 75 and 1,500 volts for direct current. It applies to a wide range of electrical equipment for both consumer and professional usage, such as household appliances, cables, power supply units, laser equipment, and certain components such as fuses. Alright, and here we have an overview of the Low Voltage Directive. So we're going to give a general overview of what it is, the mandatory products and excluded products, the conformity assessment, the required technical documents, the CE mark itself, and the surveillance that goes with the LVD. And so we're going to give a background on the Low Voltage Directive. So the old Low Voltage Directive, which was 2006-95 EC, was in force for electrical safety. And then in 2014, the new Low Voltage Directive, Directive 2014-35 EU, entered into the force on the 18th of April 2014. And in 2016, the new Low Voltage Directive, Directive 2014-35 EU, applies to products placed on the market on or after April 20th, 2016, but not before. And then presently, the new Low Voltage Directive applies to this day. Alright, so we're going to move on to the Low Voltage Directive regulated products. So the electrical equipment that is currently regulated under the Low Voltage Directive includes all electrical equipment designed for use with a voltage rating between 50 and 1,000 volts for alternating current VAC, and 75 to 1,500 volts for direct current VDC. Voltage ratings refer to the voltage of the electrical input or output, and not to voltages that may appear inside the equipment. The LVD includes both electrical equipment intended for incorporation into other equipment and equipment intended to be used directly without being incorporated. The current Low Voltage Directive covers consumer goods such as electrical appliances, lighting equipment, electric motors, alternators, electrical wiring, appliance couplers, and cord sets. And here we have a list of exempted products under the Low Voltage Directive. So the following categories of products are exempted or not regulated by the LVD. This includes things such as electrical equipment for use in an explosive atmosphere, electrical equipment for radiology and medical purposes, electrical parts for goods and passenger lifts, electricity meters, plugs and socket outlets for domestic use, electric fence controllers, radioelectric interference, and specialized electrical equipment for use on ships, aircrafts, or railways, which complies with the safety provisions drawn up by the international bodies in which the member states participate, and custom-built evaluation kits destined for professionals to be used solely at research and development facilities for such purposes. And some are very specialized and have local member state laws. And so for the low voltage directive conformity assessment, for internal production control, the product and quality system assessment procedure is carried out by the manufacturer through its own internal production control. And the obligation of the manufacturer includes technical documentation, the declaration of conformity, and the CE marking. There is no conformity assessment procedure in the LVD which requires an intervention of a notified body. And so moving on to the low voltage directive, the harmonized standards applied are EN 62368-1 2014. This is the audio, video, information, and communication technology equipment. This is replacing EN 60950-1 2006 and EN 60065 2014. The new approach in IEC 62368 focuses on demonstrating consideration on known hazards and that the product is designed to be safely operated in that context, as opposed to IEC 60950 and IEC 60065, where the emphasis is on whether the prescribed specifications have been met. Though hazard-based, E 62368-1 does not require risk analysis like IEC 60601-1. For testing, the lead time is 1 to 2 weeks and 1 sample is required. And so moving on to the technical documentation and labeling. So what is required under the LVD? This includes things such as the general description of the electrical equipment, the conceptual design and manufacturing drawings and schemes of components, subassemblies, circuits, and etc. This includes things such as schematics and a bill of materials. The descriptions and explanations necessary for the understanding of those drawings and schemes and the operation of the equipment, the results of design calculations made and examinations carried out, the list of harmonized standards applied, the test reports, and the declaration of conformity. The manufacturer shall draw up a written EU declaration of conformity for a product model and keep it together with the technical documentation at the disposal of the national market surveillance authorities for 10 years after the electrical equipment has been placed on the market. The EU declaration of conformity shall identify the electrical equipment for which it has been drawn up. A copy of the EU declaration of conformity shall be made available to the relevant market surveillance authorities upon request. And for labeling, the manufacturer shall affix the CE marking to each individual electrical equipment that satisfies the applicable requirements of the LVD. And lastly, we're going to talk about the surveillance under the LVD. So for surveillance, if there is sufficient reason to believe that electrical equipment presents a risk to the health and safety of persons or domestic animals, or to property, authorities shall carry out an evaluation covering the LVD requirements. The LVD requires that the manufacturer and others in the supply chain present documents to the market surveillance authorities in the local language of the member states concerned, and they must maintain the technical documentation for 10 years. For penalties, if found to be non-compliant, appropriate corrective actions can commensurate with the nature of the risk that may be prescribed, which can be bringing the electrical equipment into compliance, withdrawing it from the market, and recalling it within a reasonable period and commensurate with the nature of the risk as they may prescribe. And the member states shall lay down rules of penalties applicable to infringements by economic operators of the provisions of the national law adopted and shall take all measures necessary to ensure that they are enforced. The LVD requires that the manufacturer and others in the supply chain present documents in the local language as well. and that will cover the Low Voltage Directive. So the Low Voltage Directive 2014-35/EU ensures that electrical equipment within certain voltage limits provides a high level of protection for European citizens and benefits fully from the single market, and has been applicable since the 20th of April 2016. So this concludes our webinar on European market access, certifications, and approvals for electrical equipment and wireless products. I hope this webinar was helpful for you in understanding the process for European approval and certifications, as well as what requirements are applicable to your products. Compliance with the technical requirements of Europe is required for all radio and telecom products and ensures telecommunication network interoperability, avoids interference between telecommunication equipment, ensures public safety, and supports national telecommunication industries, innovation, and engineering. All electrical equipment and devices require approval for the European Union prior to distribution and placement on the market. So Vista Compliance Labs specializes in certifications, approvals, and compliance testing for electrical and radio frequency devices. We are a 17025 accredited EMC RF compliance test lab and 17065 accredited product certification body. We are a telecommunications certification body in the US, Canada, EU, UK, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, and we provide certification and approvals for all product types in countries all over the world. If you would like to stay in touch with regulatory updates, follow us online. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions on the information presented today, or any other general inquiries, you can reach us anytime at info@vista-compliance.com. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.